Hi everyone. This is going to be casual reading, kind of different from the usual readings I do. I'm going to, as I read, might provide a little bit of commentary, but I'll try to keep it pretty straightforward. But this is A Tragic Honesty: The Life and Work of Richard Yates by Blake Bailey. All right, let's see. Copyright 2003 for Mary. I'm only going to read a little bit of the acknowledgments because it's a list of a lot of names. But let's see. Acknowledgments. I am most indebted to Richard Yates's family. If any one of them had declined to cooperate, this book would have been greatly diminished. Monica Shapiro, Yates's daughter and executor, not only spent untold hours in conversation with me, but granted absolute access to Yates's papers and encouraged others to assist me. The rest of the family was unfailingly patient, friendly, and helpful. I had many delightful talks with Yates's older daughter, Sharon Levine, who also went to the awful trouble with her husband, Richard, of arranging Yates's papers and shipping them to me in large installments. The youngest daughter, Gina, sent detailed emails from her home in Honduras so that costly phone interviews could be somewhat curtailed. The forbearance of Yates's ex-wives was considerable. For the sake of this project, Sheila Yates overcame a profound reluctance to discuss her ex-husband, and I remain ineffably grateful. Martha Spear's kindness in any number of ways was among my greatest pleasures in working on this book. I deeply appreciate the contribution of Yates's nephews and niece. Fred Rogers and Ruth Ward were unflinchingly candid in discussing the details of their mother's tragic life, and I depended a great deal on the Reverend Peter Rogers for information relating to the family's history, genealogical data, as well as such priceless memorabilia as the love letters between Yates's maternal grandparents and what seems to be the only surviving photograph of Ruth and Richard Yates as small children. Equally indispensable was the testimony of Ruth's sister-in-law, Louise Rogers, the last of her family generation and a very shrewd witness indeed. When I first considered writing this book, I made a very fortunate phone call to Stephen Goldleaf, co-author with David Castronovo of an excellent monograph on Yates in the Twain's United States Authors Series. Professor Goldleaf was kind enough to send me his considerable research on Yates, which saved me enormous time and trouble and gave me momentum enough to persevere. Grace and Jerry Schulman were among my first interview subjects, and their generous assistance in every possible respect has stood me in good stead ever since. And he goes on to say a number of people shared letters, photographs, and other Yatesiana. And he names these people. I'm particularly grateful to Yates's longtime psychiatrist Winthrop Burr for agreeing to speak to me despite the conventional qualms of his profession. In the end, he decided a greater good was served by candor, and I applaud his courage. Robert Reich elaborated on our interviews with many emails full of anecdotes, philosophical musings, helpful suggestions, and so forth, such that it was rather like having a witty, hectoring Greek chorus on hand. David Milch, the most spontaneously articulate human being I have ever encountered, told me more about Richard Yates in 2 hours than I otherwise learned in an average week, and he deserves to be commended for that. And then he goes on to name many, many, many names, which shows that behind anything great, there's a community of people. And he cites librarians and libraries and faculties to where he can attain anything having to do with Richard Yates. Let's see, I'm kind of brushing past this a little bit. And research assistance. The task would have been impossible without the help and encouragement of family, friends, and colleagues. Elizabeth Kaplan is a superb agent, and Joshua Kendall is a scrupulous, tactful editor. My friend Michael Ruhlman has helped me in so many ways that the mind reels to think about it. And finally, I am blessed with a loving, supportive, and very tolerant family. Kay, Heidi, Chris, Eliza, Sandra, Kelly, Aaron, Bob, Deborah, and of course my parents, Brick and Marlies, to whom I owe debts I can never repay. As for my wife Mary, neither this book nor anything else would be possible without her. It's very sweet. He starts the book with two quotes. This from George Eliot, quoted from Middlemarch, which I haven't read yet. That element of tragedy which lies in the very fact of its frequency has not yet wrought itself into the coarse emotion of mankind, and perhaps our frames could hardly bear much of it. If we had the keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heart beat, and we should die of that roar which lies on the other side of silence. As it is, the quickest of us walk about well wadded with stupidity. George Eliot, Middlemarch. The next one, Adlai E. Stevenson. Americans have always assumed subconsciously that every story will have a happy ending. Adlai E. Stevenson. A Tragic Honesty. Prologue. From the moment Richard Yates was taken off his plane in a wheelchair back in August 1990, his associates in Alabama expected him to die there. He looked all but dead already. Still an unrepentant 4-pack-a-day smoker, despite his being diagnosed with a touch of emphysema some 20 years before, Yates had just learned the hard way that he could no longer fly without almost suffocating to death. Blue-lipped, ashen, and gasping, he was taken from the airport straight to the hospital. Members of the English department were already casting about for some other personage to fill the Cole royalty-endowed chair in creative writing, when Yates returned from his ordeal newly equipped with oxygen tanks. Feeling better, or so he said. At any rate, smoking as much as ever. Graduate student Tony Early, head of what was furtively called the Yates Task Force, worried that the great author would burst into flames on his watch. "You can't smoke with oxygen tanks," Yates's daughter, Monica, admonished him. "Media hype," Yates replied. Before Alabama, Yates had been living in Los Angeles, a place he hated in every conceivable particular. The people, the weather, the sprawl, the buildings, the fucking film business that lured him out there time and again with the promise of easy money, which for Yates meant more time to write. It hadn't worked out before, and it hadn't worked out this time. "Can you believe it?" Yates would say to the few friends who saw him out there. "Remember I said I'd never do this shit again? Yet here I am. Here I am." A phrase to which Yates was much given, wherever he was, as in, how did this happen? Bemused, stoical, a little sad perhaps, but willing to find the humor that was somewhere, surely, in his present predicament. "How did I get here? Getting out of here is an appealing idea," he told an interviewer from the Los Angeles Times. "But then, as long as I've lived, getting out of wherever I am has seemed an appealing idea." As ever, his friends and admirers wanted to help, from whatever distance they kept themselves. And perhaps none was so devoted as Andre Debut. A few years back, Debut had been the chair writer at the University of Alabama, and even then it occurred to him that this would be an almost ideal sinecure for his old friend. Basically, it was a lucrative 4-month vacation for $27,500, almost 7 times what Yates had gotten at the Iowa Workshop in 1964. One was expected to teach a single upper-level literature course and deliver a public reading, as well as occasionally comment on student manuscripts. The chair writer was lodged near the football stadium in a large furnished house, the Strode House, previously occupied by such distinguished writers as Russell Banks, Margaret Atwood, Wright Morris, and Debut himself. Sorry if I'm butchering that. Debut had likely broached the matter as early as 1985, when an ailing Yates was struggling to finish Cold Spring Harbor at his usual painstaking pace, having run through his latest advance, a state of affairs that give or take a nuance or two, was status quo throughout his career. Don Hendry, the director of the Alabama writing program and a former Iowa student, wondered even then whether Yates was well enough to take the job. He talked it over with George Starbuck, the poet, another friend from Iowa who had retired to Alabama after the onset of Parkinson's disease. Starbuck agreed with Debut. It would be a nice thing to do for Dick, who certainly deserved whatever help he got. And so it happened that several years later, with no other salvation in sight, Yates was at last welcomed to Alabama. The host of Yates fans in these parts, Henry wrote, are delighted that you will come and are looking forward to your stay. It wasn't long before Yates was figuring a way to get out of Alabama. I don't want to die in fucking Dixie, he told friends over the phone, amid gasps and coughing fits. Certainly he wasn't expected to like it in the South, never mind the eloquent speeches he'd written for Robert Kennedy at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. Yates was a New Yorker, and almost anywhere else was what his old friend Vonnegut called up the river. Yates had spent a lot of his adult life up the river, sometimes by choice as well as necessity, but in the end he'd always planned to come home. Nevertheless, when his chair semester ended at Alabama, he moved into a cheap apartment near campus, and while the many months went by, gave no sign of leaving. Said Tony Early, we were touched that Dick stayed in Tuscaloosa because he'd made friends there who looked out for him and were kind to him. Still, there was a sense of sadness that he'd ended up living among grad students who'd been strangers only 6 months before. This writer who'd once been considered on a level with Styron and Cheever. That said, the main reason Yates stayed was that he simply couldn't afford to leave. Not yet, anyway. And this was another incentive to finish the book he'd been working on for 6 years, with whatever energy he could still muster. It was a novel titled Uncertain Times, based on his Kennedy experience, which just might prove a saleable subject. All right, let's see. Around noon on November 7th, 1992, Alan Weir was informed of Yates's death at the Birmingham, Virginia Hospital, or VA, I'm so stupid, Birmingham VA Hospital a few hours earlier. Weir was director of the Alabama writing program by then, and he must have seemed as good a person to call as any. He was an admirer of Yates's work, of course, but also felt a kind of protective fondness for the man, which might explain why he can't remember who called him that day with the bad news. Amid the shock and pathos of the moment, his only definite memory is of the caller's almost hectoring urgency. What is being done to secure Yates's manuscript? The implication, Weir recalled, was that we were remiss in not barricading Yates's apartment until the manuscript was saved. The caller had no idea how uninterested the Tuscaloosa resident was in Yates's writing. Weir didn't have a key to Yates's duplex apartment on Alaka Place, but that wasn't a problem since Yates hadn't had one either. He just kept losing it, so why bother? The fact that Yates's apartment was always unlocked was widely known among people who also knew there wasn't much to steal, and to whom it would never occur to intrude except to offer help. Nor would any self-respecting burglar be likely to linger on Alaka Place, a brief stretch of road with a series of compact, semi-detached red brick bungalows on either side, where graduate students and the odd retiree lived. Yates's unit was the last on a chain where the street ended in a cul-de-sac. Yates tended to tidy up for visitors, which usually meant putting things in their proper piles and more or less clearing the floor of debris. But he wasn't much for detailed housekeeping. Friends who'd seen the inside of his apartments in New York, Boston, Los Angeles, anywhere he'd lived as a bachelor, remember the arc of cockroach carcasses around his desk, casually stamped as he swiveled to and fro in his chair, as well as the curtains of whatever color turned grayish-brown with dust and cigarette smoke, the one filthy sponge in the kitchen, and so on. Yates had been a very sick man when he left for the hospital in Birmingham, but he probably hadn't expected to die after minor surgery for a hernia. In any case, he hadn't bothered to tidy up before he left. There was a trail of wadded Kleenex all over the floor, said Weir, like Hansel and Gretel's breadcrumbs. There was also a shirt box full of pennies, nickels, and a few dimes. No quarters, as Yates had used those to buy the New York Times, which overflowed onto the floor amid the Kleenex. About $200 worth in all, his daughters counted it later. There were a few pieces of vinyl and chrome furniture with the stuffing coming out, most of it bought at the Salvation Army. Nothing in the kitchen but a jar of mustard and a few empty bottles of Heineken, and several books scattered over every surface throughout the 5 small rooms, as if Yates had opened them one after the other but soon lost interest and let them drop. Weir followed a skein of surgical tubing into the bedroom, to a large oxygen tank at the foot of an unmade bed. He searched the closet for a manuscript and was struck by Yates's wardrobe. 2 identical herringbone tweed jackets, 3 or 4 identical pairs of khaki pants, and several identical blue button-down shirts. A few pairs of 10.5 size Brooks Brothers black shoes, and 2 pairs of so-called desert boots, ankle-high, sand-colored, crepe-soled suede shoes popular in the 50s and 60s. There was also a stack of 5 or 6 sets of slate blue bed sheets, still in their store wrapping. Apparently, Yates had just put down a new set just whenever the old ones got dirty. Finally, there was a pile of Jiffy mailing envelopes, pre-addressed to the pharmaceutical company where Yates got his medication, a tranquilizer, and the anticonvulsant Tegretol for seizures and mania, but no manuscript. For a while, Weir kept looking and finally went to get help. By the time he came back with a couple of graduate students, Weir's heart had begun to sink, fraught with the implications of what he'd seen. Yates's place seemed part of some bleak motel. There was nothing that smacked of the personal except for photographs of his 3 daughters, carefully arranged on an otherwise blank wall, and an L-shaped desk with several sharpened pencils and a large cigarette burn. Apart from an old Mazda rusting in the sun, the only thing of value was an Olivetti typewriter, its owner's manual wrapped in the original plastic, but still no sign of Yates's novel. Not much for one of the 20th century's greatest writers, said Weir. Doesn't seem right. They were loading a pickup truck with Yates's belongings, such as they were, when Weir had a little epiphany. Suddenly he knew, he was sure, where he'd find Uncertain Times. He walked into the kitchen, opened the freezer, and there it was. At least 400 pages in a box. And on the last page was written in proud capitals, End. Weir read no further. Yates wouldn't have liked that, but just held the manuscript and savored his own exultation. In that freezer, that poor man's fireproof safe, he'd found the one thing that mattered to Richard Yates. Chapter 1, The Caliche Road, 1926 to 1939. If the prerequisite of any great writer's life is an unhappy childhood, then Richard Yates was especially blessed. It was not something he liked to talk about as an adult except in the most oblique terms. Once, as he walked past one of his many childhood apartments in Greenwich Village, he pointed to the iron bars on the window and remarked to a friend, "My little legs stuck out of those bars, and I used to kick the bricks. Kick, kick, kick." If pressed, he might explain that he was sitting alone in the dark, staring outside and waiting for his mother to come home. And if he was drunk and sad enough, he might talk about his mother's alcoholism or her involvement with strange men. Sometimes he'd even say that he hated her, but that sort of thing was rare. Yates aspired to a high standard of decorum both in art and life. A passage he cut from an early draft of his story, A Natural Girl, has the Yates-like protagonist David Clark announce to his young wife, "I must have had the most fucked up childhood in American history. I've told you a lot about my parents and all that, but I've always held back. I've never gotten down to the pain of it. I've been hiding and pretending all my life. It's easy to see why Yates cut this. First of all, it doesn't quite ring true in terms of the character. As Yates liked to challenge his students, would that character say that? I don't think so. But also, David Clarke's damaged psyche can be suggested in far more satisfying aesthetic terms. For example, his willingness to wear his hair in the manner of the actress Jane Fonda, because he thinks his wife will like it that way. Such details objectify the matter nicely, and no mention need be made of the character's fucked up childhood. And so in life, Yates contented himself, when sober and at his best, with the image of a barred window. Kick, kick, kick. He knew that direct explication rarely told the whole truth, and above all, he was determined to be truthful. And one of the essential truths of Yates's childhood, of his whole life perhaps, is that he loved and admired his mother at least as much as he later claimed to despise her. She was a source of pain he never could evade, though writing about her helped. She was born in Greenville, Ohio, the seat of Darke County. She later spelled dark without the E, perhaps by way of suggesting a general benightedness. Greenville, in the far western part of the state near the Indiana border, was a town of some 5,000 souls in the late 19th century, and to this day preserves some of its frontier ethos. Annie Oakley is and will always be the town's favorite daughter. She joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1885, 6 years before Yates's mother was born. And one may attend the annual Annie Oakley Days festival there, or see the many local examples of antique steam-driven farm machinery, or visit the site where the Treaty of Greenville was signed once the Indians were subdued and this outpost secured in the name of progress. Progress meant farms and schools and Main Street merchants, and of course churches. By 1875, the citizenry was divided among 8 Protestant churches and 1 Catholic. It was a world perhaps best evoked in the pages of Winesburg, Ohio. Men labored too hard and were too tired to read. In them was no desire for words printed upon paper. As they worked in the field, vague, half-formed thoughts took possession of them. They believed in God and in God's power to control their lives. Yates's grandfather, Amos Bigelow Moorer, was one of 16 children born to German immigrants, Henry and Julia Ann Biegler Moorer. Amos was 22 in 1871 when he left the hamlet of Bradford for a session of schooling in Greenville, about 10 miles away. He planned to clerk for a dry goods merchant that summer, but first he needed to perfect his penmanship, the better to write out orders and receipts with a credible flourish. His teacher in Greenville was Fanny Hatch Walden, and her own penmanship was impeccable, full of ornate curlicues and so forth, such that the sense of what she wrote was liable to be lost amid the finery, which was just as well. At any rate, she subsequently corresponded with her favorite pupil and dear friend, Mr. Moorer, who in turn did his tremulous best to emulate Miss Walden's skill. With a well-meaning travesty of loops and swirls, he wrote her from such towns as Minster, where he worked at a private auction on behalf of his employer, Mr. Sharp. He says I'm the best clerk for a beginner that he ever seen. I was in the store until 10 o'clock, sold about $40 worth. I have learned a great deal in the way of dry goods. But the Minster letter ends on a doleful note. I don't like this town a bit, because the people are all German. Amos explained without detectable irony, and Fanny replied, I should like to have seen you when you sold the first yard of goods. Would it not be nice if you could be a clerk for Mr. Sharp a while and do so well? After a while, be clerk for yourself. The two had been corresponding for more than a year before they attained this level of intimacy. In October 1873, the hand of Providence pressed them together at last. With the end of their long courtship in sight, the letter suggests the kind of life they envisioned in the heart of Darke County. Fanny, but a week away from moving out of Widow Adams's boarding house on Northeast Main Street, described a funeral she'd attended for one of the more venerable citizens of Union. He was buried in the honors of the Oddfellows last Tuesday. His name was McFeely, and there were 5 different lodges here. His remains were conveyed to the cemetery in the new hearse which we seen at the fair. Such were the rewards of a busy life devoted to faith, family, and friends. 5 lodges. And Amos was as anxious to get on with it as Fanny. He wrote her a prenuptial poem to this effect. I know thine's no worldly heart, it began accurately, then went on a bit and ended with, and now the day is close at hand. But dear, it's far enough away, yet soon will be one happy band. All close, wishing you a good day. For the honeymoon they went to Dayton. Over the next 18 years, Amos and Fanny had 7 children, at least 4 of whom, it's safe to say, were made more or less in their parents' image. The oldest daughter, Ida, lived to the virtuous age of 91 and spent her dotage painting flowers in watercolor and collecting Saturday Evening Post covers in bound 52-page volumes, one for each year. There's an asterisk here. Uncle Dick never liked Aunt Ida. Yates' sister Ruth wrote her son Peter in 1964, come to think of it, Uncle Dick doesn't like any of them. Yeah. Margaret, Mina, and Love Moore married young and moved away from Greenville. Later, they joined Ida and their parents in ostracizing their brother Rufus, who'd gone to Washington, D.C. and married a Jew. Elsa Moore was different somewhat, at least as respectable as her sisters, and deeply spiritual. She inherited these qualities without quite the dose of provincial bigotry that went with them. Rather late in life, she married a math professor who, within a few years, drowned off the coast of Galveston. Before and after this event, Elsa devoted her life to contemplating the infinite and helping her sister Ruth, the youngest and most wayward of the lot. As with Rufus, the rest of the family would have little to do with Ruth and vice versa, which left Elsa, who had always had both time and a bit of money to spare. Ruth Walden Moore was born December 31st, 1891, though her entry in Who's Who of American Women gives her birthday as exactly 5 years later, as do her entries in all of the various artists' directories and even her Social Security application. Indeed, it's likely that her own children, who called her Dookie, oh, this is his mother, to distinguish her from her daughter and namesake, were unsure of their mother's age until a sad day in 1961 when circumstances forced them to find a birth certificate. You know how Pookie's always been about her age, says Sarah Grimes in the Easter parade. But such fudging was a minor detail in a vast reinvention that began almost at birth. A quest for self-realization by a woman who was, as her son wrote of her model in A Special Providence, remarkable and gifted and brave. How else could anyone explain the story of her life? At the turn of the century, when all the sleeping little towns of Indiana had lain locked in provincial ignorance, and when in that environment of a simple dry goods merchant named Amos Grumbauer had raised 6 ordinary daughters, wasn't it remarkable that his 7th had somehow developed a passion for art and for elegance and for the great and distant world of New York? Give or take a few syllables, the passage sticks to the facts, as does most of Yates's fiction about his family. Just like Alice Prentice in A Special Providence, Dookie left her hometown before she finished high school, and was in fact one of the first female students at the Cincinnati Art Academy, where she studied china painting and drawing from life. At the time, she had only a vague idea of becoming an artist and wouldn't settle on a particular métier until much later. Her immediate goal was to gain the skills to get out of Ohio and find a job in New York, and never to look back except in scorn and derision. For the rest of her life, Dookie scoffed at everything that struck her as bland and bourgeois, though in one respect, at least, she never left Greenville. No matter how bohemian she later affected to be, or how destitute she often became, Dookie was always proud to call herself a good Republican. She had probably grown up hearing the phrase good Republican as an index of respectability in clean clothes, Yates speculated in a later story, and maybe she had come to relax her standards of respectability, but good Republican was worth clinging to. Dookie would later say she married beneath her, and no doubt she meant a number of things by that. At least in one respect, though, she married about as far above herself as she could get. For Richard Yates's lineage on his father's side is very distinguished indeed. What's more, Yates was aware of this. I know, he replied when his nephew Peter, an amateur genealogist, told him they were direct descendants of one of the country's first great men, Governor William Bradford of Plymouth. The most powerful colonial governor, a man of legendary virtue, Bradford is best known as the self-taught author of History of Plymouth Plantation, a classic among literary annals, notable for its directness of style, the author's determination to tell the truth in the plainest possible language. Yates, if he gave the matter much thought, and there are reasons to suspect he did, may well have been proud of such an ancestor. The Bradford connection came through Yates's paternal grandmother, Clarissa Antoinette Cleveland, a member of the same illustrious many-branched family that produced Grover, the country's 22nd and 24th president, and Moses, the founder of Cleveland, Ohio. In 1864, Clarissa married a seminarian, Horatio Yates, who later became one of the most active and respected Methodist clergymen in central New York. The followers of John Wesley stress the social responsibility of Christians, and Horatio Yates clearly took that aspect of his calling to heart. After moving his growing family from one tiny pastorate to another throughout Cayuga County, Yates became chaplain of Auburn State Prison in 1887, a year after the birth of his eighth and last child, Vincent Matthew, the father of Richard Yates. Vincent's formative years then were spent, happily or not, in the parsonage of a prison that was infamous for its brutality. The so-called Auburn system was informed by the spirit of Calvinism, a belief in the utter depravity of humankind, and its foremost mandate was to break the prisoners' spirits through beatings and floggings, forced labor, solitary confinement, shaved heads, striped suits, and lockstep. Such a life was conducive to thinking about one's heavenly reward. And in 1826, the Auburn warden Gershom Powers conceived the idea of a resident chaplain, a man activated by motives of public policy and Christian benevolence, he wrote. Residing with convicts and visiting their solitary and cheerless abodes, they will consider him their minister, their guide, their counselor, and their friend. The evidence suggests that Horatio Yates was all these things. One of his grandson's most cherished possessions was a violin lovingly carved by a prisoner for Chaplain Yates, with a woman's head at the end of the fingerboard and a mother-of-pearl inlaid case. Okay. Footnote: Richard Yates told his friends Grace and Jerry Schulman that to him the violin was a symbol of his family's history and breeding, and he entrusted it to the Schulmans when he became too transient to bother with precious things. They presented this heirloom to Yates's daughters at his memorial service. Wow, it's amazing. Horatio Yates' devotion to his wayward flock became a matter of public record in August 1890 when the country's first capital punishment by electrocution took place at Auburn State Prison. William Kemmler had killed his common-law wife, Tilly Ziegler, with a hatchet, and was held in a single cell for almost a year waiting for death. Horatio Yates visited the man several times a week and read to him from a picture Bible. Kemmler was mentally deficient. The prisoner's last hours were spent in prayer with the kindly chaplain, who provided such a comfort that Kemmler insisted he be one of the 26 witnesses to the execution. "Gentlemen, I wish you all good luck," said Kemmler as he was strapped to the chair. "I believe I am going to a good place and I am ready to go." Horatio Yates, having convinced the poor man of God's infinite mercy, sat and watched with the others as shock after shock failed to kill him. As he gasped and gurgled, his teeth grinding audibly, the capillaries bursting on his cheeks, the room filling with the stench of roasting flesh and feces, until several witnesses fainted and the district attorney ran retching for the door. Chaplain Yates's reaction went unrecorded, though the episode might have put things in a curious perspective for a while. In any case, he continued to serve as chaplain for several more years, and his passing in 1912 was noted at respectful length by all the Auburn newspapers. His son Vincent was destined for a life of comparative obscurity. A small man of average good looks and few apparent pretensions, he made little impression on his son or the world at large, except in a single respect. He had a lovely tenor voice. Though not quite enough talent or monomania to make a career out of it, I think he sang professionally a few times, Yates surmised, in a good school. I imagine he joined the General Electric Company in Schenectady as a delaying action in order to have a few dollars coming in while he continued to seek concert engagements. But before very long, the company swallowed him up. This is Yates being characteristically scrupulous. Most likely he knew very little about his father's life, and even in a piece of fiction, albeit one published as an autobiographical foreword in the New York Times Book Review, he would not pretend otherwise. It's quite possible that Vincent Yates tried to sing professionally, failed, and then accepted the truth of his relative mediocrity, and spent the rest of his life, sadder but wiser, as a small-time corporate drone. That he was, in short, a kind of Yatesian hero, the modest man who refuses to live a lie. That, anyhow, is the way Yates portrays fiction, though it appears to have been a somewhat revisionist view. Outside his work, Yates rarely discussed his father. To his friends, family, and even his psychiatrist, he dismissed Vincent as a cipher, someone he hardly knew. But imaginatively, he tried hard to fathom this rather dull but decent man who spent most of his adult life as an assistant regional sales manager for General Electric, Mazda Lamp Division, who was patient and reliable in meeting the demands of a flamboyant, profligate ex-wife, and who had a fine singing voice but at some point gave it up for good. Yates's fullest fictional treatment of his father is Lament for a Tenor, his second published story written 11 years after Vincent's death. Footnote: at the time, 1953, Dookie was still alive and lucid, and Yates worried about her response to Lament for a Tenor, his first explicitly autobiographical work about his family. He was living alone in England when the story was accepted by Cosmopolitan, and it fell to his wife Sheila to explain the premise of Tenor to Dookie. Duke knew right away that it was autobiographical, Sheila wrote her husband from the States, and wasn't too happy, but said she'd realize you'd eventually write about things that she might be uncomfortable about. She defended the artist's right to do that and launched into her story about those friends of Thomas Wolfe. Dookie's defense of artistic freedom, even at her own potential expense, is commendable, though it's safe to assume she had no idea what lay in store for her following Tenor. It seems to reflect a rather guilty impulse to pay belated homage to the man. The protagonist is a 16-year-old boy who tries to find something to mourn in a dead father he'd always neglected. Among other things, he recalls one of his infrequent visits to his father's office, where a framed photograph of a salesman's outing at Tupper Lake had caught his eye. He came upon his father between two heavy bald men whose glasses flashed in the sun. He looked as if he'd tried all weekend to get into the spirit of the thing, but was lonely and tired now, anxious to go home and even beginning to feel sorry for himself. An operatic tenor lost among the salesmen. A series of further flashbacks culminates in an epiphanic moment when, as a very small child, the protagonist actually heard his father sing. When his voice came, it was amazingly big and rich, filling the room. La donna immobile che piumo al vento. And though his father botches the final note with a cough, my wind shot, the son is too full of pride and love to speak. Vincent is an essentially idealized figure in the fiction, too idealized in the case of Tenor, which might explain why the story was never collected. His typical function, at least in the later work, is to serve as foil to the selfish, pretentious characters based on Yeats's mother, and both parents suggest a larger dialectic between realistic and romantic viewpoints, that is, between people like Vincent who refuse to deceive themselves, who don't insist on their own importance, and people like Dookie who do. To some degree, Vincent may have been such a paragon. Certainly, he was good about paying alimony, but in everyday life at least, his son wasn't particularly sentimental about him, and was even somewhat equivocal about who neglected whom. "I didn't give a shit about why he wasn't home," said Yates. "I just wanted him there." Dookie and Vincent were married on July 3rd, 1920. She was pushing 30 and he was on the brink of premature middle age, and one assumes that both were lonely. Later, Dookie would deplore having married such a tedious man, and perhaps God alone can measure the magnitude of Vincent's regret. But at the time, it might have made a kind of sense. Both had fled from rather claustrophobic home lives, in Vincent's case, a literal prison no less, where each had been the youngest and least conventional of a large family. Footnote: black sheep status for Vincent is harder to establish, but not impossible. His mother Clarissa's obituary in the Auburn Citizen, May 14, 1918, indicates that 3 of her 4 married daughters had made their homes near Auburn, while the 4th lived in Norwalk, Ohio. Of 3 surviving sons, one was doing YMCA work in Georgia, presumably following his father's footsteps, while 2, William and Vincent, lived in Chicago and New York, respectively. A roisterous uncle appears in both Tenor and A Special Providence, and perhaps this is the brother William, in which case Vincent wasn't the only one with cosmopolitan tastes. Still, it seems doubtful that both sons of the pious old minister considered a career, however briefly, in show business. So perhaps Vincent was the bigger misfit of the two, at least by his family's standards. Let's see. Both had a degree of artistic talent, and all the better for Dookie that Vincent had given up his own manque, striving himself to a mundane but respectable career. He could thus support her growing desire to become a sculptor. And finally, by most accounts, both were alcoholics, as both their children would be. Their daughter Ruth was born August 4th, 1921, and spent her first 8 years in the picturesque village of Hastings-on-Hudson, 10 or so miles upriver from Manhattan. Later, Ruth would say that those early years on Hastings had been the happiest of her life, as much a reflection on the relative happiness of her adulthood as on that idyll by the Hudson River. Be that as it may, her parents' marriage was 2/3 over when her brother Richard Walden. Footnote: Yates hated his middle name and would not be teased about it, at least not as an adult. He may have wondered why, with such ancestors as Bradford and Cleveland, he was named after a provincial penmanship teacher. Or perhaps he just thought it was a silly name. Was born on February 3rd, 1926, in a Yonkers hospital. He later wrote that his sister's nostalgia for the Hastings era made him envious, because he could scarcely remember it at all. And since Yates wasn't inclined to write about things he couldn't remember in terms of mimetic mood and detail, his fiction gives only a faint glimpse of that time. As in Cold Spring Harbor, when the father's look of ruddy health after the first few swallows, When the father's look of ruddy health after the first few swallows of whiskey reminds his son vaguely of rare and unexpected Christmas mornings long ago. Hardly a vision of Proustian enchantment, but for Yates it would have to suffice. By the time he was 3, the best of his childhood was over. To understand why his parents divorced, one may look in a number of directions. Dookie's artistic pretensions had become more desperate with time, and it may have been that Vincent didn't take these seriously enough, or at any rate balked when she asked him to pay for a year of study in Paris. And perhaps for Dookie, all this was part of a greater malaise, a sense that she was being stifled like her counterpart Pookie in the Easter parade, who always used to compare herself with a woman in a doll's house. As for Vincent, there were probably times when the dull grind of breadwinning got him down, and like the father in a special providence, he may have been driven to the odd bout of debauchery. He would disappear for 3 and 4 days at a time and come home reeking of gin with lipstick all over his shirt. And perhaps, too, it was partly a matter of Vincent's enthusiasm for Democratic Party politics, his friendships with the dreadful little Irish people from Tammany Hall, as the Dookie surrogate, a good Republican, puts it in Oh, Joseph, I'm so tired. In sum, they seem to have been very different people after all, with little more in common than a fondness for liquor and cigarettes. Dookie left after 9 years and took the children, but more particularly, she took her son. As Yates wrote in A Good School, he and his father had an unspoken agreement. I had been given over to my mother. There was pain in that assumption, for both of us, I would guess, though I can't speak for him. Yet there was an uneasy justice in it, too. Much as I might wish it otherwise, I did prefer my mother. I knew she was foolish and irresponsible, that she talked too much, that she made crazy emotional scenes over nothing, and could be counted on to collapse in a crisis. But I had come to suspect dismally that my own personality might be built along much the same lines. In ways that were neither profitable nor especially pleasant, she and I were a comfort to one another. By the time Yates wrote these lines, he'd had 50 years to reflect on just how alike he and his mother were. Indeed, to be reminded of it again and again, and while he despised his mother's failings all the more for seeing them in himself, such an awareness certainly improved and in some ways was limited to his art. As a young man, he discovered Flaubert, and Dookie became his foremost Emma. His sense of her and hence humanity proved vital to his bleakly deterministic worldview. As he explained in a 1972 interview, his characters all rush around trying to do their best, trying to live well within their known or unknown limitations, doing what they can't help doing, ultimately and inevitably failing because they can't help being the people they are. That's what brings on the calamity at the end. Yeats's compassion for human weakness, for the flaws that make failure so inevitable, is everywhere in his work. With the occasional exception of certain characteristics based on his mother, which range from the rounded and essentially forgivable Alice Prentice in A Special Providence to Dickensian grotesques such as Pookie in the Easter Parade and Gloria Drake in Cold Spring Harbor. Telling or not, Yates also tended to be hard on characters based on himself, but all are worthy of our sympathy in at least one respect. They do their best, but fail because of limitations over which they have no control. After all, she was only a human, Yates liked to say of his mother, having just relieved himself of some scathing diatribe on the subject. For much of Yates's early life, though, he and Dookie were a comfort to one another. Daughter Ruth was something of a comfort as well, but she was more her father's child. And after the divorce, she continued to visit him as much as possible. At one point, she even pretended to need weekly rather than monthly orthodontia as a pretext for going into the city. But Richard had never really known his father and never really would. He preferred to stay at home with Dookie, a kindred soul whom he resembled not only in temperament but appearance, from the great mournful eyes and dark pouches beneath them to the never-corrected overbite that made his plump upper lip protrude slightly, features he despised. The first thing Dookie did after the divorce was take that trip to Paris. She'd been accepted by Academe Julian to study under the eminent sculptor Paul Landowski, but also she wanted to expose her precocious 3-year-old to the kind of high culture that only Paris could provide. Footnote: later years said that his mother's excuse for dragging him around Europe was to broaden his horizons. But really, it was just a matter of ensuring that his father would keep paying the bills. One suspects it was a little of both. She left Ruth behind with her sister Elsa, a decision that was likely a mutual one. There was the expense of taking both children, and while it seems reasonable to take a sentient 8-year-old for company rather than a toddler, Ruth was probably only too happy to stay behind, knowing even then what a trip abroad with Dookie might entail. What Dookie hoped to achieve was perhaps more complicated than she was willing to admit. On the one hand, she meant to learn her craft from a great master and perhaps achieve greatness herself. But the girl from Greenville might also observe continental manners firsthand and refine the kind of sophisticated persona that might enable her, along with her reputation as an artist, to be admitted into the highest social circles. The art of sculpture and the idea of aristocracy had always appealed to her equally. Yates wrote in A Good School, a notion he explored further in Oh Joseph, I'm So Tired. Her idea was that any number of rich people, all of them gracious and aristocratic, would soon discover her. They would want her sculpture to decorate their landscaped gardens, and they would want to make her their friend for life. It's possible that Dookie's artistic aspirations were animated to some extent by petty snobbery, but it's also fair to point out, as many do, that she worked hard to realize such talent as she had, and often under circumstances that were far from aristocratic. And then, too, it's hard to blame her for hoping to make friends with the sort of people to whom it might never occur to collect Saturday Evening Post covers in bound volumes. Whether Dookie found what she was looking for in Paris is impossible to say. What was meant to be a year of study was cut short after 6 months or so, when the stock market crashed and she had to come home. The toddler Richard remembered little or nothing of the whole expedition and rarely spoke of it, though he reported in his fiction that it had been confused and unpleasant for his mother, who could hardly pronounce, much less speak, French, and who was almost certainly broke most of the time, no matter how much she later milked the subject for conversational purposes. As for her work as a sculptor, it must have improved somewhat since she began to have her first minor successes not long after her return, and certainly she liked to invoke Landowski as one of her mentors. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. Dookie seems to have become even less conventional after Paris, a liberation that may have begun amid the studios and cafes of the left bank, or else just the inevitable letting go of a lonely divorcee at loose ends, in Depression-era Greenwich Village no less. Somewhat paradoxically, though, she remained much concerned with matters of propriety, reluctant to speak of indelicate things, and always an elegant dresser, though also rather loud and crude at times, and her well-chosen clothes tended to be stained in some sadly obvious way. Perhaps all this was reconciled in the name of worldliness, or nobility at odds with circumstance, but one can't help but wondering how it affected her son, who inherited the same contradictions to a remarkable degree. Also, as a young man anyway, he cherished the dream of Paris as a place where one might find oneself as an artist and a man, though in this respect his mother wasn't the only influence. For a while after her return, Dookie and the children were all but alone in the world. Her family hadn't approved of the divorce and later relished the chance to spell this out by refusing to come to Ruth's wedding. In the meantime, they simply stayed away. Dookie's older sister Elsa was the one exception, and she lived nearby and was willing to help. Her ill-fated husband lay a few years in the future. It must have been a comfort. Anyway, up to a point. Elsa was very sensible in contrast to Duke. Yates's first wife Sheila remembered, but she wrote it pretty hard. The woman appears as the bossy and meddlesome and condescending Eva in A Special Providence, who disapproves of her sister's marriage and then of her divorce. Still, Elsa deserves a certain amount of credit just for sticking around, as she did for the duration of Yates's childhood and beyond, amid sporadic and no doubt salutary estrangements. Her grandnephew Peter described her as a stable center in the children's lives, suggesting the lack of that quality in every other aspect, in every other respect. And while Yates would sometimes complain that it was his lot to live among women, a mother, sister, and maiden aunt, later 2 wives and 3 daughters, he seemed grateful to Elsa for propping his mother up through her many misadventures. And Elsa had every reason to be exasperated, of course. A notable cause of Dukey's loneliness, then as later, was her singular lack of compunction where money was concerned. Her only income at the height of the Depression was whatever small amount Vincent could spare in the way of alimony and child support. And yet she insisted on a standard of gentility. Large apartments in the village or rented homes in nice suburban neighborhoods that she couldn't remotely afford to maintain. When the money ran out, as it always did, she'd sponge off of friends and neighbors until there was nobody left and it was time to move on. Duke's fantastic schemes have a horribly dreamlike, almost nightmarish quality when they begin to crash about her ears. Sheila Yates wrote her husband in the 50s, when such disasters had become a dreadful theme in their lives. But the whole hysterical odyssey had begun some 20 years before, as Dukey's determination to be an artist, to vindicate herself in the eyes of a patronizing provincial family and ex-husband, distracted her almost entirely from the more practical aspects of motherhood. And while the bills went unpaid and the family was evicted from one place after another, Dukey became all the more emotionally dependent on her children. She encouraged them to view their chaotic lives as an adventure. The 3 of them against the world. She was a free spirit, Yates wrote in Regards at Home. We were free spirits, and only a world composed of creditors or of people like your father could fail to appreciate the romance of our lives. As part of the romance, Dukey would read aloud from Great Expectations when they were hungry or awaiting another eviction. The children could further identify with Dickens in terms of their seedy clothes, which made them conspicuous at whatever new school in whatever nice neighborhood they found themselves from one year to the next. At the time, Yates adored what he perceived to be his mother's gallantry and goodness, and since he made few friends, perpetually being the only new boy and the only poor boy, he became almost desperately attached to Dukey and vice versa. For the rest of his life, he was terrified of being left alone, and during childhood his shattered nerves were evidenced by, among other things, a bad stammer, which later seemed to return in the form of a chronic cough that became more pronounced when he was ill at ease. And what about the art for which all these sacrifices were made? She wasn't a very good sculptor, Yates put it bluntly in Joseph, referring mostly, if not entirely, to the stiff and amateurish quality of her early work, circa 1932. Her specialty after Paris was modeled garden figures cast in lead, nymphs and geese in pipe-playing pans that were meant to decorate the lawns of the wealthy, but usually ended up as part of a growing clutter that followed the family into their next living space, however modest. But Dukey remained undaunted. A big sale or one-man exhibition was forever in the offing. And while occasional little coups did occur, they never brought much in the way of money or acclaim. Meanwhile, Dukey's favorite model for her fawnlets, often posed in the nude, was the small, obliging Richard. In a special providence, the mortified 4-year-old son of Alice Prentice hunches over to cover his genitals. Round-eyed with humiliation, while neighborhood children laugh at him from a studio window. Footnote. A childhood friend recalled seeing a pan figurine for which the very young Yates had modeled. Dukey had altered the face, but the spindly upper body above the goat legs was recognizably Richard. Many years later, Yates told his youngest daughter, Gina, that what he remembered best about his mother was her body odor, that she smelled bad. No matter how hard she tried to clean herself, doubtless the rotten tomato smell he attributes to Gloria Drake in Cold Spring Harbor. And body odor is one of many ignominious nasty physical details that recur among Dookie's fictional personae: rotten teeth, lipstick smeared outside the mouth, stained clothing, sweat armpits, and so on, most of which work to suggest the essential instability of the woman, her sweaty, incipient hysteria. In many cases, Yates makes the matter explicit, as in regards at home. It had often occurred to me that she was crazy. There had been people who said she was crazy as long as I could remember. Gloria Drake is flatly described as mentally ill, and everywhere in Yates's work there are scenes of screaming, writhing fits thrown by mother characters, after she'd lost all control and gone on shouting anyway. In short, it seems far from implausible that Dookie suffered from a degree of mental illness, possibly the manic depression that afflicted her son, a disorder that's almost entirely genetic in origin, and perhaps some other form of mood disorder. And even if there weren't such a hereditary link, the chaos she always engendered would have certainly taken a psychological toll. As it happened, Yates later complained of cruel bullying voices in his head that made it hard to sleep and often horrific to dream, voices that evoked some bizarre tantrum or another that he'd overheard as a child. After a couple of years in a rural Connecticut farmhouse, though it was far beyond Dookie's means, its chief virtue was a large barn where she could work on her sculpture. The family moved to its first and perhaps best Greenwich Village apartment, the place on Bedford Street so lovingly described in Joseph. There were 6 or 8 old houses facing our side of the courtyard, and ours was probably the showplace of the row because the front room on its ground floor was 2 stories high. Dookie crowded the room with her garden figures and turned it into a high, wide, light-flooded studio, while Ruth and Richard shared one of the 2 small bedrooms upstairs. When alone together, the children mostly spent their time either playing in the courtyard, a few stunted city trees and a patch of grass that Dookie always called the garden, or listening to afternoon children's programs on their majestic radio in the dining room. Toward the back of the ground floor was the least appealing part of this or any other of their apartments, a roach-infested kitchen, with a stove and a sink that were never clean, and a brown wooden icebox with its dark, ever-melting block of ice. Apart from an instinct for rudimentary tidiness that she passed on to her son, Dookie had little apparent relish for detailed housework. Rather than wash the dirty dishes, she'd regularly send her children out to buy paper plates. And Yates mentions the odors of mildew and cat droppings and plasticine to evoke the basic bouquet of his childhood. Most days, Dookie worked hard at her craft, but it would be several years before she had any sort of gainful employment, and the leisure hours must have seemed long at times. Later, she became active in a number of art organizations, but as long as her children were still at home, there was less need for such distraction. The 3 of them were together constantly, and their principal way of killing time was going to the movies. As an adult, Yates lost the habit entirely, and once when someone left him a television, he never bothered to plug it in. But he often startled friends with detailed and rather emotional accounts of the movies he'd seen in the 30s. I wasn't a bookish child, he wrote in a 1981 essay. Reading was such hard work for me that I avoided it whenever possible. But I wasn't exactly the rough and ready type either, and so the movies filled a double need. They gave me an awful lot of cheap story material and a good place to hide. Slight, frail, and morbidly shy, Yates felt intimidated by the tough Italian kids in the village, and for a long time he wasn't entirely at ease in any company other than his mother and his sisters. Like the Drakes in Cold Spring Harbor, the 3 didn't bother to check show times, but simply wandered in off the street. Much of their pleasure came from waiting for prolonged confusion to clarify itself on the screen. Then, after the movie had come full circle, they'd watch it again, to intensify the story they already knew. Such total insularity in their everyday routines might have led to rather esoteric behavior, not unlike the Drakes' ritualized baby talk that no outsider could probably have followed. Little wonder Yates had trouble adjusting to the various institutions, prep school, the army, and so on, of the outside world. Despite a lifelong dependence on her children, Dookie was not entirely without friends. In fact, her new village milieu afforded a number of congenial people who seemed to appreciate her as an artist and hostess. One of her neighbors on Bedford Street was Howard Cushman, best known as E.B. White's roommate at Cornell. Dookie and Cush became friends, and at least once he brought the illustrious White around to meet the 12-year-old Ruth, who'd started her own weekly courtyard newspaper modeled somewhat after The New Yorker. Ruth's younger brother would also become a great fan of the magazine. Cushman's daughter from a previous marriage, Nancy, was Richard's age and a playmate of sorts. One of her father's gags was to drape her in his suit jacket and crouch behind her with his own arms in the sleeves, a routine Yates described in Joseph, and later adopted with his own daughters. The sight of a smiling little girl, waving and gesturing with huge, expressive hands, was enough to make everyone smile. Such parlor tricks formed the lighter side of village domestic life. Perhaps the most abiding friendship of Dookie's adult life was with Cushman's ex-wife, Elizabeth, a journalist who'd met her former husband in the city room of a New Rochelle newspaper. On the surface, she and Dookie had little in common. Elizabeth Cushman was a self-supporting socialist who, as Yates characterized her in Trying Out for the Race, liked to have it known that both her parents were illiterate Irish immigrants. While Dookie's ancestors were scarcely more distinguished, this was the sort of thing that chafed at her quasi-aristocratic Republican sensibilities. But happily, each was rather bitter about life and appreciated the other's mordant wit. They would get together and trash things, as one friend put it, beyond which lay an even deeper affinity. Richard, we are growing old, Cushman wrote the 19-year-old Yates in the course of describing how she and Dookie had just celebrated VE Day. You were too young to know the evenings when a pinch bottle Haig and Haig was but a drop in our bucket. Judging by his fiction, however, Yates had known such evenings all too vividly, as well as other evenings and other drinking companions. The various boozy, dilettante-ish divorcees whom Dookie cultivated in the village, the Natalie Crawford and Sloane Cabot types, who liked to use words like simpatico, and wrote unsaleable radio scripts whose characters included a sad-eyed 7-year-old philosopher with a comical stammer. There was a lot of drinking, and the consequences were often unfortunate given the presence of small children. Yates never quite got over the shock, however, often repeated, of seeing strange men at his mother's breakfast table, and made a point of never exposing his daughters to any woman who was not his wife. Indeed, Dookie's alcoholism and love of affairs suggested a larger, more troubling theme to Yates's mind, what he referred to reluctantly in so many words as an improper closeness with his mother. One hastens to add that Yates despised psychological jargon and wasn't apt to invoke Oedipus complexes and the like, much less accuse his mother of sinister motives, conscious or otherwise. Which is not to say that he didn't blame her and deeply for the damage done. Such was his sense of helplessness as a child, reinforced in any number of ways by his mother, that he'd often throw panic-stricken seizure-like tantrums when she'd leave him alone at night, and he never forgot what it was like to lie awake in the dark, wondering when or if she'd ever come home. And when she did, late, drunk, she had a tendency to comfort her son by getting into bed with him. At least once, as in Joseph, she vomited on his pillow. Yates felt enraged at his mother, said his psychiatrist Winthrop Burr, who recalled that Yates, usually circumspect to the point of brusqueness during their sessions, would often get on the edge of tearful when he discussed her. Her alcoholic inconstancy, along with the mutual dependence she always elicited, was a disastrous combination. It was as if he were her only confidant, said Burr. He gave a picture of the two of them alone in the world. The sister was a blank. To a great extent, the sister was overshadowed by the mother. Prentice's lack of a sibling in a special providence is telling, at least in terms of pathological impact. But Ruth, too, was much on Yates's mind, especially in light of later events. On the rare occasions that he'd mentioned her as an adult, he tended to say they had little in common. And in a way, this was true, but it was also misleading, if only by omission, perhaps because Yates preferred to work out the deeper truth in his fiction. Ruth was characterized as the most stable member of the family, the one like her father, and as such, she was a good sister to Richard. They were comrades in a difficult situation, said Martha Spear, Yates's second wife, who remembered stories of Ruth and her sister having to forage for food and generally look out for each other. But it was more than a matter of Ruth's being the relatively responsible, protective one. She was also the imaginative one, at least as a child, and almost as painfully sensitive as her brother. Like him, she aspired to be a writer from a very early age. There were, there were, there were the weekly newspapers she devised, the plays she acted out with paper dolls, and at night she'd lull Richard to sleep with stories she made up in the various bedrooms they shared. Someone should probably have told my mother that a girl and boy of our ages ought to have separate rooms, Yates noted ruefully in Joseph. And all her life Ruth cried a lot, though the cause was liable to be emotional rather than physical. Like Sarah Grimes in the Easter parade, the young Ruth split her head open on a steel pipe. Footnote, Martha Spear remembers it as a clothesline, which may be so, but Yates was fastidious about rendering such literal details as accurately as possible in his fiction, and the horizontal steel pipe in the Easter certainly reflects a further effort of memory, which left a small but permanent scar as well as the impression, which her brother never forgot, that she bore pain remarkably well. But perhaps Ruth's most salient feature is suggested by Sarah's look of trusting innocence that would never leave her. Such innocence, coupled with the awful insecurity she shared with her brother, would lead Ruth into a ruinous, life-wrecking marriage, or so Yates believed, and characteristically, he blamed his mother. Even now, at 17, he wrote of the Ruth character Rachel Drake in Cold Spring Harbor. She felt heavily handicapped by ignorance. But Rachel's mother refuses to discuss indelicate things like the facts of life with her. She could evade almost any question with her little shuddering laugh. And the troubling thing about this attitude was that it seemed to always come from carelessness or laziness, rather than from any kind of principle. Pookie in the Easter parade is similarly evasive, and when the 14-year-old Alice Towers, in trying out for the race, asks her mother Lucy about a pregnant schoolmate, Lucy responds with revulsion and tells her daughter, in effect, to mind her own business. And Alice looked wounded, an expression even more frequent on her face lately than on her mother's or brother's. Whether Dookie was guilty of such pernicious hypocrisy is hard to say, and maybe little more than a tendinous attempt on Yates's part to make sense of his sister's tragedy. That Ruth was something of a knave, though, and sadly desperate for love and assurance, is not in doubt. As a teenager, she joined Frank Buchman's moral rearmament movement, which encouraged confessions and chaste open love among its members, and not long after that she would find a more final escape in marriage. Dookie's first real success as an artist, at least in terms of exposure, came in 1933 when she was given the opportunity to sculpt a bust of President-elect Roosevelt. The whole episode is so superbly recounted in Oh, Joseph, I'm So Tired, that it's difficult to do much more than speculate and summarize. Probably her friend Howard Cushman, called Howard Whitman in the story, did get her the entree, as Dookie would have it, through an old newspaper friend who was part of Roosevelt's New York staff. And Dookie would certainly be apt to regale her friends with an account of irreverent banter at FDR's expense. While she measured his head, I said, "I didn't vote for you, Mr. President," I said. I'm a good Republican and I voted for President Hoover." He said, "Why are you here then?" And I said, "Because you have a very interesting head. I like the bumps on it." And Yates's appraisal of the motive for such effrontery, indeed, for the whole affair, namely that the headlines would scream, "Gal sculptor twits FDR for bumps on head," pretty much puts the matter in a nutshell. The episode seems almost too pat in terms of the quintessential Yates story. What with its romantic-minded mother about to realize her dreams at last, only to be crushed by the cruel disparity between expectations and reality. Of course, such a précis hardly does injustice to a story as subtly textured as Joseph, though perhaps it does sum up the basic facts of the case. That Dookie's FDR head was laughably too small and looked like a serviceable bank for loose change is not just an ingenious objective correlative for the story's sake, though it's that too. In fact, the head was about half life-size, according to the only real publicity the business attracted. About 75 words buried in Section 2, Paragraph 3, Column 8 of the New York Times. Bust given Roosevelt. President sat for Ruth Yates at January press conference. A small bronze lead bust of President Roosevelt was presented to him today by Miss Ruth Yates, New York sculptor. The bust, which is about half life-size, was made during Mr. Roosevelt's press conference at his New York house, just before his trip to Warm Springs in January. This was the only time he could devote to sittings for the bust. A further line mentioned that Miss Yates studied under Paul Landowski in Paris, but said nothing about how, as Yates imagined the newsreel and feature articles Dookie might have hoped for, she'd come from a small Ohio town, or of how she'd nurtured her talent through the brave, difficult one-woman journey that had brought her to the attention of the world. But it was a start, and meanwhile Dookie's life seemed to look up in other respects. Since around this time she found her only enduring boyfriend after the divorce, the tall and dignified and aristocratic Englishman who appears as Eric Nicholson in Joseph, and Sterling Nelson in A Special Providence. As with the FDR story, one can add a little to the fiction. All that's known for sure, more or less, is that such a man existed and stuck around for a year or so before suddenly dropping out of sight to Dookie's and the children's regret. Though in the children's case, it was more a matter of longing for a conventional home life than any particular fondness for the man himself. As for the details, they're all but identical in both the novel and story. The man apparently worked in the New York office of a British export firm, specified as a chain of foundries in Joseph, and had a wife in England from whom he wasn't yet technically divorced. At some point, he seems to have persuaded Dookie and the children to share a house with him in Scarsdale, despite the stigma of living out of wedlock in such a community. The question of whether or not she would find it awkward being called Mrs. Nelson remained unsolved. Nobody in Scarsdale called her anything at all. And one day he escaped his creditors by returning to England and his wife, leaving a lot of shabby furniture and forged art as a kind of consolation prize for Dookie. The forged art, as such in A Special Providence, may have been a flourish of poetic license on Yates's part, along with a 3-year subscription to Field and Stream Nicholson gives the 7-year-old son in Joseph. That impenetrable magazine was the least appropriate of all the gifts because it kept coming in the mail for such a long, long time after everything else had changed for us. But one suspects such details are as true as the rest of it. Further testimony to Yates's selective genius, his ability to shape life in the precise terms of his artistic vision. The gentility of living in Scarsdale must have grown on Dookie, perhaps her neighbors, despite her neighbors' indifferences. Despite her neighbors' indifference or outright hostility toward the odd woman who spent her days sculpting in the garage. Because the Englishman's desertion left her unable to pay the rent, and because she was lonely, She coaxed her friend Elizabeth Cushman to move with her daughter Nancy into a somewhat cheaper house Dookie had found on the nearby Post Road. Together, the two families could even afford to live in Maid, though that left them with only one bedroom per family. The arrangement was probably not as volatile as it's depicted in the story Trying Out for the Race, or rather there seems not to have been any lasting clash between the two mothers, but the respective dysfunctions of the families appear to be faithfully portrayed. Sometime let's have a little discussion about that sentiment-smothered thing called maternity. Elizabeth Cushman wrote Yates somewhat later, having referred to her daughter in the same letter as a zombie child. From this one might safely assume the factual basis of the frenzied quarreling between Elizabeth Hogan Baker and her 9-year-old daughter in the story, culminating in such remarks as, "I wish that child were at the bottom of the sea." Bad mothers and a tendency to throw tantrums were things Nancy and Richard had in common as children, with a difference in the former's case that might have proved fortunate to the latter. "I know she'll come back," Nancy says calmly to Russell Richard in the story after her mother abandons her for an assignation in the city. "She always does." Whereupon the boy reflects that an attitude like that was exactly what he needed in his own life. Whether or not by Nancy's example, a somewhat greater maturity on Richard's part is suggested by the fact that around the age of 10, he began to make a friend or two among boys his own age. And lest he seem a sissy in their eyes, he made a point of either ignoring or terrorizing his female housemate during their visits, as she remembers to this day. The move in 1937 to Beechwood, the vast estate of a Frank A. Vanderlip in Scarborough-on-Hudson, was the result of Dookie's work as a sculpting teacher. The Westchester workshop in White Plains didn't pay much, but Dookie's loneliness and boredom must have been desperate enough by then to make her classes more than worthwhile, especially since her students, as Yates described them in A Special Providence, tended to be women of her own age or older, prosperously married and vaguely dissatisfied. A few of these women befriended Dookie, and one of them arranged for her to meet the chatelaine of Beechwood, Mrs. Vanderlip herself, who seems to have been charmed. She not only agreed to rent Dookie one of the outbuildings, but also gave her the use of a large studio space, where she could teach private classes and thereby make enough money, in theory, to pay for the privilege of being in such rarefied surroundings. And for a time they were happy. Beechwood was congenial in almost every respect. The 50-acre estate was a well-manicured wilderness of elms and beeches and giant rhododendron bushes, in the midst of which ran a clear brook and many slate paths, past statuary and gardens transplanted whole from European castles. Above it all loomed the Vanderlips' 5-story mansion, visible from every part of the estate and a constant remainder of the sort of aristocratic grace to which Dookie so wistfully aspired. Just as importantly, the Vanderlips themselves were no Philistine tycoons, but rather great patrons of education and the arts. On the property was the ultra-progressive Scarborough County Day School, founded by Frank Vanderlip in 1913, a place where arts and crafts were emphasized almost as much as science and math. Creativity in general was much admired, and talented people were always welcome at Beechwood. Isadore Duncan had danced on the lawn, and another great chronicler of American middle class would later occupy a house there. The swimming pool is curbed with Italian marble, John Cheever wrote in a 1951 letter from Beechwood, at the beginning of his almost 10-year tenancy, lucent and shining like loaves of fine sugar. Let's see. I missed a footnote. The careful reader will note that Yates didn't bother to change either Nancy's or her mother's real first names, save one letter. In drafts of his later fiction, Yates would often write the actual name of the person on whom a given character was based, and then alter the name slightly in revision. Perhaps as a mnemonic device, he tended to retain actual first names as well as cadence of his models' last names. The Yates family had recourse to the same pool, not far from the northeast estate where they lived in a white stucco gatehouse. Formerly the school's kindergarten, it consisted of a single large room, about 30 feet square, plus a tiny bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen. The quarters were tight as ever. The children had to sleep in the main studio. Uh, let's see. The children had to sleep. Okay, I'll get it. The children had to sleep in the main studio come living room, but at least now there was less reason for the timid Richard to hide inside with his mother and sister. Dookie had enrolled her children in Scarborough County Day. Needless to say, she couldn't really afford the tuition, and the 11-year-old Yates blossomed there. He used to speak of it as the peak of his childhood popularity, said his daughter Sharon, followed by a long, nasty descent into an unhappy puberty. The school philosophy placed heavy emphasis on fostering growth and uniqueness, and this allowed Yates to tap into a latent, at least where the outside world was concerned, silliness that stood him in good stead among children as quirky as he. He was much given to making droll and generally inoffensive fun of students and teachers alike. When the art teacher asked the class to paint a picture expressing their emotions, Yates submitted a blank sheet of paper titled Gloom, a work that belied his remarkable facility as a cartoonist. He doodled on everything, his friend Stephen Benedict remembered. Papers at school, doilies, letters, images of cats, caricatures of teachers, Joe Louis, Adolf Hitler. Such doodling remained an abiding interest, but at the time Yates's fame as a poet was far greater. The doggerel poured out of him, said Benedict, and the headmaster's daughter, Mary Jo McCluskey, who had a crush on Yates, wrote him a fan letter 40 years later in which she remarked, "I remember how you used to delight us all with your spur-of-the-moment poems. Guess you were destined to be a writer of prose anyway." A sample of Yates's output from this time suggests he was unlikely to rival his beloved Keats. The only noise I hear all day in the clanking of a can. Shit, I already fucked it up. The only noise I hear all day is the clanking of a can. I drive a dirty, smelly truck, for I am a garbage man. The city dumps its waste on me to throw into the river, and I can't stand that gooey smell. It kind of turns my liver. Yates was elected president of his class, or so he remembered. Others remember differently or not at all, though most agree Yates was fairly popular, which must have seemed an apotheosis of sorts after the morbidities of his early childhood. Stephen Benedict and his older brother Russell were Yates's best friends in Scarborough, and the youngster's activities suggest the kind of off-center precocity Yates may have had in mind when he described the interesting products of progressive education and a special providence. Stephen and Richard formed the Scarborough Jitterbugs, a two-man ocarina band that approximated such popular standards as the Andrews Sisters, They Mir Beast Duchesne, and Oh Johnny Oh. We energetically rehearsed, then tootled away on numerous occasions for anyone who'd listen, Benedict recalled. Almost every piece would be punctuated by one of us with a sepulchral moo of an enormous bass ocarina, certain to break up anyone in range. That sad yet comic sound will forever bring Dick to mind. Perhaps encouraged by her son's ocarina prowess, or just the general ambience of juvenile creativity, Dookie hired a Mr. Bosselman to give Richard private violin lessons at the gatehouse. Either the instrument didn't catch on, or Dookie didn't pay the man, or both, but Yates's musical career seems to have stalled with the Scarborough Jitterbugs. Meanwhile, Russell Benedict, influenced by Yates's sister, started a weekly newspaper in his basement, the Scarborough News Sheet. 6 pages of society items, gossip, cartoons, and gags. Yates's contributions. And the odd subversive hit, such as a photo Russell had taken and pasted in all 100 copies of a drowned vagrant woman on a slab at the local morgue. Corpses Withal, such a novel and nourishing world, came at a crucial time for Yates and had a lingering impact that went well beyond the obvious. He pondered this in a 1961 letter written after a reunion with Stephen Benedict, and 2 weeks before the publication of his first and most famous novel. Had dinner tonight with an old boyfriend. No, jeez. Retract. Had dinner tonight with an old boyhood friend from the years 1937 to 1939, when I lived in a town called Scarborough, whose amateur theater group, the Beechwood Players, served as the original for the I'm getting tired, the Laurel Players, in my book. He found it incredible, and I found it spooky, that I had completely failed to remember the name of a winding blacktop road in that town on which he and I, many of our schoolmates, used to pass the most impressionable hours of our formative years. Revolutionary Road. Pretty Freudian, buddy. The sad yet comic moo of the bass ocarina, a strikingly apt leitmotif for the life of Richard Yates, should be sounded at this point, as things began to fall apart in Scarborough. For one thing, Yates's relative popularity wasn't likely to last while his long, nasty descent into puberty gained momentum. By the age of 13, he was already taller than most of his peers, but not much developed in other respects. If anything, the attenuation of his body seemed to make him weaker, and he could hardly have appeared more clumsy if he'd tried milking it for laughs, which he didn't. And despite the school's emphasis on creativity and so forth, it also lavished prestige on its student athletes, especially in the upper grades. And this universal fact of prep school life boded ill for Yates. Even Stephen Benedict, who was smaller and a year younger, always prevailed in their frequent wrestling matches, which seemed to bother Yates in a quiet way. For the rest of his life, in fact, he'd be haunted by a sense of physical inadequacy, which would manifest itself in a number of curious and not so curious ways. And then, of course, there was the matter of Yates's poverty, for which his seedy, undernourished appearance served as a kind of advertisement. Most of his schoolmates came from wealthy or at least comfortably middle-class families, and Yates was made keenly and increasingly aware of their snobbery. Susan Cheever, who experienced the same paradox while living at Beechwood, wrote, "We had the luxuries of the very rich, rolling lawns, a swimming pool, gardeners who doffed their caps, but we were tenants, scraping to get by." And here was the dark side of Scarborough. Though creativity and personal charm were pluses, they were no substitute for money, and one learned the hard way how suddenly one's sense of belonging could evaporate when a few bills weren't paid. For her part, Dookie worked hard to preserve her cherished foothold on the estate. She tried to recruit more students as well as improve her own work in the hope of that elusive, lucrative one-man exhibition by dispensing with garden sculpture in favor of direct stone carving and abstract forms. But her progress as an artist brought little material reward, and the good life she'd come so close to grasping began to slip away. It had to be a bitter business. Almost nightly, the Vanderlips entertained in their downstairs parlor, and the elegant guests in their evening clothes could be seen through tall lighted windows. Dookie herself had attended the larger parties in the ballroom amid grand pianos, liveried servants, and the great Van Dyck painting Andromeda, as such occasions tended to be open to the nicer and more creative part of the public, to all, that is, but the truly impecunious, as the Yateses would soon become. But then at least one member of the family definitely benefited, as an artist anyway, from such harsh reversals, since a lifelong sense of exclusion informed the best of Yates's work. A scene in A Special Providence, for example, has Alice arriving at Boxwood and attending the Vandermeers' lavish Christmas party. It pays homage to a similar scene in Madame Bovary. From the practical viewpoint of which she was wholly incapable, Dookie never had any business living at Beechwood, though she wasn't one to give up without a fight. No doubt she tried to get her children's scholarships increased at the school and was denied on the basis of merit or lack thereof. Footnote. In A Special Providence, the aptly named headmaster, Dr. Cool, produces Bobby Prentice's file and shares its contents with Alice. The record disclosed that Bobby's IQ had been assessed at slightly above average and that he had done reasonably well in the fields of social adjustment and personality growth, but his capacity for self-discipline had received the rating of poor, and of the 6 units of study assigned to him during the academic year, he failed 2. Finally, he reads aloud one of the more biting teacher comments. Robert may eventually turn out to be as precocious as he seems to think he is, but if he expects to prove it to me, he will have to buckle down. All this rings true, and for what it's worth, the actual headmaster recognized himself when he read the novel in 1977. Dad has been running around calling himself Dr. Cool at every opportunity, his daughter wrote Yates. And no doubt she got her exasperated ex-husband to agree yet again to exceed the terms of the divorce agreement and pay off the more immediate bills. Perhaps Dookie continued to hope that the larger situation could still be saved somehow. More students, a one-man show, even as she grew more cranky, as Stephen Benedict recalled, combined with a good deal of cynicism about life in general, which she clearly felt had not been good to her. Life would get a lot worse. Before long, she was telling her children not to answer the door, and finally, the Vanderlips took legal action to evict her and recover the many months of unpaid rent. There was no time to finish the school year when Dookie and her children fled an entire region of creditors in the spring of 1939. All I remember is that you sort of disappeared overnight, and the headmaster's daughter wrote Yates, and no one would tell me why, and I was heartbroken. They found refuge of sorts in Austin, Texas, where Aunt Elsa had gone to live after her marriage to the math professor. This much we know, and if we trust a special providence, and perhaps we should at this point, at least in terms of the big picture, we can also assume that Elsa's semi-retired husband was something of an anti-Semite who drank too much and liked to hold forth on such topics, as the menacing rise of the American Negro. What matters for our purpose is that he seems to have found Dookie distasteful and bullied her son, a mama's boy, he thought, who should be back in school. I hate him. Alice Prentice ends up screaming at her hapless sister. Oh, I know you only married him because he was all you could get, but you're a fool. He's a beast. Or words to that effect, which understandably might have led to both mother and children staggering through a sweltering construction site, with their suitcases in hand and a total of 75 cents among them. What's interesting and pertinent about this scene, as rendered in the novel, is the way the cheerful, heartening son helps his mother overcome her exhaustion by encouraging her to imagine that the hot Caliche dust is actually snow, a freezing blizzard from which they have to escape as quickly as possible. For years, whenever they were faced with any ordeal, she would gain strength from saying, "Remember the Caliche Road?" Yates remembered the Caliche Road all right, in whatever form it took, but as time went on, he became less inclined to collude in his mother's delusions. Indeed, his childhood tendency to be an accomplice to such folly, as well as its foremost victim, would forever rankle. As much as anything, this was the goad that made him determined to expose the truth, no matter how depressing, that people like Dookie are apt to bury beneath layers of everyday self-deceit. For Yates, it was a matter of good art, though it certainly applied to life itself. For Yates, it was a matter of good art, though it certainly applied to life as well, to friends, family, and arguably with the poorest result, himself. The most important thing, he liked to say, is not to tell or live a lie. Pity and forgiveness were important too, however hard they came when one knew the worst about a person. Once, when Yates was responding to questions about his work, a young woman commented on how awful the mother was in A Special Providence. So careless and thoughtless and self-centered. and asked Yates what he thought of her. "Oh, I don't know," he said quietly. "I guess I sort of love her."